Montana Territory. Early spring of 1873, snow still lined the edges of the Bitterroot Range, and Nolan Reddick figured he had learned how to live without a heart. He was 28, lean from cattle drives, and too used to silence. 4 years had passed since the fire took the homestead, and with it, his younger brother and everything warm that had ever touched Nolan's life. Since then, he had worked ranch to ranch, never settling long, always moving. He did not ask questions, and he gave no answers. His eyes were tired, his voice quiet. But that morning, the wind shifted. He had been heading north, cutting across the edge of a long-abandoned property near the foothills of the Sapphire Mountains. The barn had collapsed in on itself like a rib cage, but the stable, though leaning, still stood. He was not planning to stop. Then he heard it. A voice.
Soft. Singing.
A woman's voice, carrying through broken slats of wood. The melody was low and aching, almost whispered, but it cut through the air like sunlight through storm clouds. Nolan froze in the saddle. His horse, dusty, flicked an ear uneasy. He dismounted and stepped closer. His boots crunched softly over brittle grass. He pushed the creaking door open. Inside, on a nest of old hay, sat a young woman, clothes torn at the hem, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. In her lap, wrapped in a worn blanket, was a baby, maybe a year old, sleeping against her chest. The woman looked up. She did not scream. She did not beg. She only shifted slightly, wrapping her arms tighter around her child. Nolan raised both hands. "I am not here to hurt you."
She did not speak.
"Name's Nolan Reddick. I was just passing through. Heard you singin'. That your baby?" "Yes," she said finally. Her voice was hoarse. "His name is Hayes." He nodded. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Nora Keller." He crouched a few feet from her, careful not to spook her. "Stable here's falling apart. You two cannot stay here." "I know," she whispered. "But we had nowhere else." "Where's his father?" Nolan asked. "Gone," she said. "Long before Hayes was born." Nolan took a slow breath. She looked young but grown. 20, maybe 21. Her hands were chapped from wind and cold. She had the look of someone who had kept walking long past the point of exhaustion. "You got family?" "No one left." She tucked Hayes closer. "My mother died when I was 16. I worked as a seamstress for a while in Helena. Then the man who got me with child vanished. I tried to stay with a church group, but they turned me away once they saw the boy." There was no bitterness in her voice, just the quiet truth of it. Nolan felt something shift in his chest. A long dead part of him stirred, uncomfortable. "You hungry?" he asked. "I will manage." "I was not asking if you would manage." He pulled a wrapped biscuit from his saddlebag. "Here." She looked at him a long moment before reaching out and taking it. Hayes stirred in her arms. His small fingers curled around her shawl, his cheeks flushed from sleep. Nora kissed the top of his head gently and then tore off half the biscuit, offering it to the baby. Nolan leaned against the wall. "This stable is not safe. Storm's comin' in tonight." "I know," she said again. "I heard wolves last night. You would not hear them tonight with the wind howling." She looked at him, eyes clear despite the weariness. "Why do you care?" He did not have an answer for that. But he could not stand the thought of her and the baby freezing to death in a place like this. Maybe it was the way she had rocked her child. Maybe it was the song. Maybe it was just
time.
"I got a camp," he said. "About an hour west, not far. Dry, out of the wind. I have extra blankets. You can rest there tonight. I do not know you." "No," he nodded. "But you will not last out here another night." Nora looked down at Hayes, then back at Nolan. "If I go with you, it is just for the night." "Understood." She stood slowly, adjusting Hayes against her hip. Nolan stepped back, letting her pass. She walked out into the fading afternoon light, her boots crunching in the frost. He saddled Dusty and offered her the reins. "You ride?" "Not well," she admitted. "I will lead him. You can sit behind the saddle." She hesitated, then nodded. He helped her up, steadying her as she climbed behind the saddle, cradling Hayes tightly between them. The ride was quiet, wind curling through the pines. Nolan did not speak, and neither did she. But every few minutes, he felt the soft brush of her hand against his coat as she adjusted Hayes or steadied herself. By the time they reached his camp, a small lean tucked between two large boulders, with a canvas tarp stretched tight and fire already set, Nora was shivering. He helped her down gently, then handed her his spare blanket. "Get close to the fire. I will take care of the horse." She nodded, moving slow but steady. Nolan watched her settle near the fire, curling Hayes close, wrapping the blanket around both of them. The baby let out a soft sigh and nuzzled into her chest. Nolan unsaddled Dusty, brushed him down, and tied him under a pine. When he came back, he saw Nora had taken out the last of the biscuit and was feeding it to Hayes in little bits, humming under her breath. The same tune from the stable. He sat across from her. "What song is that?" "My mother used to sing it. Old lullaby from Kentucky." "It is nice." Nora's eyes flicked to him. "You do not look like the kind of man who says nice things." "I am not," Nolan said. She gave a small smile and looked back to the fire. They ate quietly jerky and beans and what little bread he had left. Hayes fell asleep again in Nora's lap. "You lost someone," she said softly, not looking at him. Nolan's jaw clenched. "Yes. I can see it in your face." He looked at the fire, not speaking. "I do not need to know," she added. I understand." Nolan looked at her. Really looked. Her face was pale from cold, but her eyes held something solid. Not fragile, not broken, strong. He said nothing more that night, but when she fell asleep curled against the warmth of the fire, Hayes breathing softly in her arms, Nolan laid another blanket over them both. He did not sleep much. The wind picked up. Coyotes cried far off on the ridge. But every time he glanced toward the fire and saw Nora and her boy safe and warm, something deep in him started to thaw. And he did not look away. The next morning came gray and brittle. A thin crust of frost coated the pine needles, and the coals in the fire had burned low. Nolan stirred first, rising slow so as not to wake the boy. He kept his movements quiet, his breath visible in the cold air. Nora's eyes opened as he stood. She didn't startle, just blinked sleep from her lashes and adjusted Hayes against her. The baby's fingers curled along the edge of her shawl, still warm from the fire. "I need to fetch water," Nolan said, voice rough from sleep. "There's a creek down slope. Won't be long." Nora gave a small nod. "We'll be here." He left them wrapped together, the sight tugging at something quiet in his chest he didn't have words for. The path to the creek was narrow, the ground damp beneath his boots. He dipped the canteen and waited, watching the ripple of current. When he returned, Nora was feeding Hayes soft crumbs of bread from her pocket. She glanced up as Nolan stepped back into camp. "He's kept warm enough," she said. "I'll need to wash his things later. He's only got what's on him." "There's a wash basin at an old line shack I passed 2 days east," Nolan said. "Was empty then. No stock, but the roof holds. We could reach it by nightfall if we make steady pace." Nora looked down at Hayes. "He won't ride long without fuss." "I figured we'd walk part of it." She didn't answer right away. "Then, you plan to keep riding after that?" "I don't stay places long." "I can tell." Nolan crouched to add pine to the fire, glancing at her through the smoke. "You don't strike me as someone meant to drift." "I wasn't, but meaning to and having the choice aren't always the same." He didn't press further. Instead, he pulled a scrap of flannel from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "For Hayes. In case the wind picks up." She took it, brushing her thumb over the fabric before wrapping it around her son's shoulders. "Thank you." They packed in silence. Nolan cinched the saddle while Nora tied her bundle with practiced, efficient hands. She didn't ask for help. When they began walking, she kept a steady pace beside him, holding Hayes snug against her chest. Dusty followed behind, reins loose in Nolan's grip. By midday, the clouds had thickened, and the wind moved through the trees with a low groan. They stopped near a stand of spruce. Hayes was fussing now, red-cheeked and restless. Nora shifted her weight, bouncing gently, her hips swaying with the rhythm of her steps. "He's hungry again," she said. "I can nurse him if you give us a minute." Nolan gave a short nod and stepped off the trail, giving her space. He leaned against a tree, watching the branches sway. He hadn't heard a baby cry in years, not since before the fire. The sound had once brought frustration. Now, it brought a strange kind of grounding. When Nora rejoined him, her hair was windblown, and her eyes had softened. "He always settles after," she said. "Like the world feels right again." They walked on. As the trees thinned, the land opened into a stretch of lowland meadow. The grass was yellowed from winter, but the breeze carried the faintest scent of thawing earth. In the distance, the outline of the line shack came into view, tilted but dry-looking. "We'll make it before dark," Nolan said. "You always plan your steps that far ahead?" "Only when somebody else is walking with me." Nora raised an eyebrow. "That happen often?" No, she didn't tease him about it. Just walked a little closer. By the time they reached the shack, Hayes had fallen asleep again, his head tucked beneath Nora's chin. Nolan pushed open the warped door. The space inside was tight, but clean enough. A cot in the corner. A rusted stove. A chair missing one arm. He set to clearing the ash from the stove while Nora sat on the cot, holding Hayes close. "I'll boil water," Nolan said. "You can try washing his things once he's down." She nodded, then glanced around the room. "How do you know about places like this?" "Been through most of this territory." "You learn where not to freeze." She looked at him a long moment. "You always keep to yourself?" "It's easier that way." "But not better," she said, voice low. He straightened from the stove, met her eyes. "No," the kettle hissed soft as the stove came to life. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside the shack it was warm enough for now. Nora laid Hayes down on the cot, careful and slow. Nolan handed her the basin and stepped outside to give her privacy, while she washed the boy's clothes. The air had that scent of wet timber and soil, the kind that signaled spring wasn't far. When he came back in, she had hung the damp clothes by the stove and was rubbing her arms for warmth. He tossed her his coat without a word. She looked at it, then him. "You'll be cold." "I'll manage." She wrapped it around her, the sleeves long past her hands. "You don't just do that for anyone." "No," he said, sitting down on the floor near the stove. "I don't." Hayes stirred in his sleep, a small sound like a sigh. Nora spoke again, voice quiet. "He doesn't have anyone else. He's got you." Her eyes glistened. She didn't blink them away. "I don't know what kind of life I can give him." "You're giving him one," Nolan said. "That's more than most." The kettle began to whistle. He stood and poured water into a mug, then held it out to her. She took it, hands brushing his. "You remind me of someone my mother used to talk about. A man who never said much, but always showed up exactly when needed." "I'm no one's storybook." "No," she said. "You're real." "That's better." Nolan sat again, his back against the wall, legs stretched toward the stove. The warmth crept up slowly, settling into the air between them. "You ever think about staying put?" she asked. "I used to." "What stopped you?" "Fire took the place I planned to stay." She didn't ask more, just sipped her tea and leaned her head back against the wall, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled against the eaves, but inside, The world had narrowed to a single room, a sleeping child, and two people slowly learning the shape of quiet company. Nolan watched her from beneath lowered lashes. The way her fingers curved around the mug. The steady breath she took. He didn't know if they would keep walking after tomorrow. But tonight, their first real night under a roof, he let the warmth settle in his chest and didn't push it away. The storm passed some time before dawn. Wind still scraped at the window frame, but the worst of it had moved east. Inside the lined shack, the stove glowed faint orange, and the smell of charred pine hung low in the air. Nolan rose first. He folded his blanket, set it aside, then reached for the tin kettle. When he poured water into the pot for coffee, the sound stirred Nora. She sat up slowly, brushing strands of hair from her face. Hayes was still curled beside her, one tiny hand resting on the edge of her coat. "That coffee?" she asked, voice husky. "Will be," Nolan said, keeping his eyes on the firebox. She stood, stretching her back with a quiet wince. "I dreamed I was back in Kentucky. Horse fields and thunder rolling in the distance." "You miss it." "I miss my mother's hands pulling biscuits out of the stove," she said. "And the porch in summer. I don't miss much else." Nolan handed her the mug once the pot boiled. "You ever think about going back?" "Not with a child born out of wedlock. Folks there don't forget what they think they know." He nodded once. "Then you're better off out here." She held the mug carefully, steam rising past her face. "Are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he crouched to check the boy's clothes drying near the stove. Still damp. "Won't make good time carrying wet things." "We've got time," Nora said. "Unless someone's expecting you." "No one is." He caught her studying him. Not cautious anymore, just curious. She sat down across from him, folding her legs beneath her skirt. "You ever been married?" she asked. "No. Ever want to be?" "I used to." Nora looked down into her coffee. "I almost did. Right before Hayes. He was a Cooper's son. Kind, but quiet. Never asked me much about what I wanted." "What did you want?" "To put my name on something. Land, a little garden, maybe a cow. A place that couldn't be taken by someone else's choice." Nolan leaned back against the wall. "You could still have that." Her eyes lifted to his. "You think a woman like me can still settle down?" He didn't speak for a long while. Then, quiet, "I think you're stronger than most who already have." She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased. Hayes stirred, rubbing his face into the cot's edge. Nora bent to lift him, cradling his weight against her. He reached for her shawl with a drowsy grunt. "I'll step outside," Nolan said, rising. "Don't have to," she said. "You've seen worse, I imagine. Doesn't change what's decent." She watched him cross the room and step out into the morning light. The wind had settled to a breeze, and the sky had fractured into soft blue streaks. Patches of snow still clung to the roots, but the earth beneath was thawing. When he came back in, Nora had dressed Hayes and strapped his bundle close to her chest. Her damp clothes hung forgotten by the stove. "I've been thinking," she said, adjusting the boy's wrap. "You said you don't stay places long. But if I'm going to start again, I need help. Not charity. Help." Nolan leaned against the doorframe. "What are you offering?" "I know how to patch clothes, mend seams, bind books, and make candles." "You know cattle and horses. We could manage a small place if it's got water." His jaw worked a moment. "You'd trust me like that?" "I'd trust how you've treated my son without asking for anything back." He looked down at the floorboards, then back at her. "I know a hollow past the ridge. Old trapper's cabin's still standing. Spring runs near it. Nobody's claimed it in years. Would it take much to fix?" "Some hands and a few boards." She shifted Hayes onto her hip. "Then maybe that's where we start." His voice, when it came, was steady. "You sure?" "No," she said. "But I've learned that waiting for sure things means missing the ones worth reaching for." He crossed the room, took her bundle from the cot, and slung it over his shoulder. We'll need to move before the snow melts too deep. River crossings get rough. I've crossed worse, she said, following him out into the light. They walked side by side, not speaking much. The trail narrowed as it climbed, but neither paused. Hayes slept again, his head rising and falling with Nora's steps. By the time they crested the ridge, the sun had broken through fully. Below, the land opened into a small basin, pine-ringed and quiet. A cabin leaned against the slope, smoke long gone from its chimney, but the roof still held. Nora stopped beside him. It's not much. No, Nolan said. But it's something we can build from. She looked at him, eyes clear. That's all I've ever wanted. He didn't touch her. Not yet. But he stood close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed, and when she looked back down at the hollow, she didn't look alone. And for the first time in years, neither did he. The hollow held quiet like a held breath. They stood at its edge until Hayes stirred, and Nora adjusted him against her. Then Nolan stepped forward, boots crunching over old pine needles, and led them down the slope. The cabin's door hung crooked, one hinge rusted near through. Nolan tested it, then lifted it from the frame and set it aside. Inside, the air was dry and still. A single room, with a narrow hearth and a table missing a leg. Dust clung to the rafters. A squirrel nest filled one corner. Nora stepped in behind him, her gaze moving slow. We'll need to clear that out before dark. I'll take the nest. You see if the chimney pulls. She set Hayes down on a wool blanket Nolan had laid over a saddle pad. The child, now wide-eyed, kicked his feet and made small, pleased sounds. Nora crouched beside him, smoothing his hair back before rising to check the hearth. Nolan carried out the ruined chair and dropped it beside the cabin wall. The nest came out in 3 trips, dried moss and fur bundled in his arms. When he returned, Nora had coaxed a thin line of smoke from the chimney and was feeding it with bark. Draw's all right, she said. Once the soot clears out. He nodded and crossed to the window, wiping grime from the pane with his sleeve. Sun's dropping fast. There's a spring, she asked. He pointed past the brush. 20 paces that way. I'll show you. She followed him, her skirts catching on the low bramble. They reached the spring just as a pair of quail flushed from the undergrowth. Water trickled clear from a stone outcropping into a shallow pool. She crouched and dipped her cupped hands into the flow. It's colder than it looks, she said, shaking droplets from her fingers. You'll get used to it. She stood, brushing her palms on her apron. We'll need to wash clothes tomorrow, and boil what we can. They walked back without talking. Smoke curled from the chimney now, thin and pale. Hayes had drifted to sleep again, curled against the pad. Nolan lit the lantern with a match, flame flickering weakly against the glass. You ever build furniture? She asked. Enough to make something stand. I can stitch bedding, she said. If you can find the canvas. I know a trapper south of here. Might trade cloth for jerky. She knelt by Hayes and settled beside him, legs folded beneath her. How long do you think before the land softens enough to plant something? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Depends on how fast the melt runs off. She looked toward the hearth, where the fire had caught stronger now. What would you plant first? Beans. They take to the soil easy. After that, maybe squash. You?
Chard, she said.
My mother used to braise it with vinegar. It keeps well if you dry it right. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her not just the way she moved, but the way she already spoke as though the place were hers. As though she'd always known how to claim space without asking for permission. You think you'll stay? She asked, not looking at him. I would not have brought you, if I didn't plan on it. She nodded once.
Good.
Hayes needs steadiness. I won't leave him hanging. She met his gaze then, steady. Or me.
No, he said.
Not you either. The lantern's light flickered across the rough walls. Outside, the wind had quieted. The land was still, like it knew something was being decided. Nora rose and laid another log on the fire. Tomorrow, we should clear the brush from the backside. I saw a patch that might take to root vegetables. I'll take the axe to the shed. Might be some tools worth sharpening. She turned back to him, her voice softer now. You don't have to sleep on the floor.
Vi slept vers.
I know, she said, but you could sleep beside us. If you want. He looked at the cot, then at her. You sure? I wouldn't offer if I wasn't. He crossed the room and knelt beside Hayes, brushing one finger over the boy's blanket. Hayes shifted in sleep, then stilled again. Nora sat beside him. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone rougher. Someone who looked away. I did. For a long time. She didn't answer, just leaned her shoulder lightly against his. They sat that way until the fire burned low, and the lantern's flame dimmed to a soft glow. And when she reached for his hand, he let her take it. The days passed in weathered rhythm. The snow gave way in patches, revealing dark, wet earth beneath. Mornings brought the sound of thaw dripping from the cabin eaves, and the cabin itself began, piece by piece, to belong to them. Nolan patched the roof with cedar bark and nailed the door back to its frame with iron he bartered for from a traveling fur trader. Nora scrubbed the floor with lye water boiled over the hearth and stitched new bedding from flour sacks she'd kept in the bottom of her bundle, each marked with initials worn faint by time. Hayes took his first steps between the cot and the wall, his arms open wide, his balance uncertain but his joy fierce. They didn't speak of the past anymore. It sat between them like a stone already turned over, its underside exposed, damp and done with. One afternoon, Nora stood at the edge of the clearing, sleeves rolled, hands sunk into the turned earth where she'd begun to carve rows with a split-handled hoe. Nolan watched her from the shed where he was repairing a broken yoke, his hands blackened with pitch. You're working that soil like you expected to answer back, he said, stepping over the threshold. She straightened, brushing her palms down her skirt. Maybe I do. I figure if I give it enough of myself, it'll give something back. You always talk to it? When no one else is listening. He offered her a tin cup of water filled from the spring. She drank, her eyes never leaving his. I've been thinking, she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. We've made something here. Not just a roof and a stove. Something steadier. He nodded. It feels that way. I don't want to keep waiting for the next hard turn. You think I do? She stepped closer.
No.
I think you're just too used to it. The wind moved through the pines behind them, soft and slow. Hayes let out a giggle from where he sat playing with a stick in the dirt near the fence line Nolan had started building 2 mornings before. You want to marry me? She asked, eyes direct. Nolan blinked. You always ask that straight? I've done enough waiting in my life. I'd rather not waste time pretending I don't know what I want. He looked toward Hayes, then back at her. You sure? I've never been more. He nodded once. Then yes. She stepped back and smiled, not wide, just enough to reach the corners of her eyes. All right then. They didn't have a preacher. They didn't need one. That night, under the blue hush of dusk, they stood in the doorway of the cabin, hands clasped, while Hayes slept in the cot inside. Nolan recited the only words he remembered his parents exchanging when they married. I'll stand with you, come sun or smoke. Nora answered with her own. I'll hold what we build. They kissed once, slow and certain. Then they went inside and banked the fire and lay beside their son. Spring deepened. The garden sprouted green shoots. Nolan traded salted meat for a goat from a Dakota man passing through with his kin, and Nora began making cheese from the milk. Hayes learned to toddle over the uneven floorboards, reaching always for his mother's hem or Nolan's calloused hand. There was no rush in their days, no fear pressing in from the corners. One evening, Nolan sat on the front step sharpening his knife. Nora joined him, her hair damp from washing. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You ever think we'd end up like this?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I'm glad we did." She looked out toward the trees. "I think we're safe now." "We are." The sun dipped low, brushing gold across the edge of the clearing. Hayes babbled from inside the cabin, chasing shadows on the wall. Nolan set the knife aside and took Nora's hand in his. "I've never had a place that felt like mine. Not until you." She pressed her palm to his chest. "Then it's ours. All of it." He kissed her there on the step, with the smell of earth and pine between them, and the sound of their child's laughter rising like birdsong from within. Years passed. The garden grew wide and full, and the cabin gained a second room. Hayes grew tall and sure-footed, with his mother's steadiness and Nolan's quiet grit. They built a life from the hard ground up, not perfect, but solid. Together, they faced drought and frost and the long silence of winter, and through it all, they remained what they had become, a family. No one remembered the woman who had been turned away or the man who once wandered alone with a fire behind him. Only the ones who passed by the hollow saw the fence line strong and clean, the smoke rising warm from the chimney, and the laughter of a child echoing through the trees. And they knew that love, when it's tended like a field patiently, without fear, roots deep and holds.